They mocked her for being a simple secretary until she took over the company they worked for. The grand ballroom of the prestigious Hilton Hotel was draped in gold and white, glittering under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The annual corporate gala of Westbridge Enterprises was the social event of the year, where executives flaunted their wealth, exchanged business cards with smug smiles, and sipped champagne as if it was water. Amid the crowd of tailored suits and designer gowns stood Grace Nolan, dressed modestly in a simple black dress that barely stood out. She clutched her glass of sparkling water, quietly observing the room from a corner, unnoticed by most, except when someone needed to hand over their coat or inquire about schedules. She was the company's executive assistant, the invisible glue that kept operations smooth, but tonight, she was nothing more than an afterthought. The laughter grew louder as a group of executives gathered around Robert Ellis, the charismatic head of marketing. His booming voice carried across the room as he regaled his friends with stories of his recent vacation. His sharp suit and confident grin made him the center of attention, and he thrived on it. Grace had the misfortune of walking past their group when Robert's eyes landed on her. With a sly grin, he raised his glass. "Hey, isn't that Grace?" "The secretary who's practically part of the furniture," he chuckled, drawing laughter from the group. Another colleague, Amanda, added with a smirk, "Must be tough attending parties like this when you're just here to refill coffee during office hours." Grace froze for a brief second, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the sting of humiliation prick her skin, but she forced a polite smile and kept walking, pretending the words didn't affect her. The laughter echoed behind her like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Inside, however, her emotions roared like a storm. She wasn't angry because they were wrong, she was furious because they didn't know how right they were to underestimate her. What they didn't realize was that she was far more than the woman who scheduled meetings and answered phones. But Grace had learned the value of patience, of staying quiet until the perfect moment to speak. Later that evening, as the party carried on with drunken toasts and shallow conversations, Grace found herself standing near the balcony, staring at the city lights. She could still hear snippets of their mockery, woven into the buzz of the crowd. But instead of letting it weigh her down, she allowed it to fuel her quiet determination. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. The difference now was that she had all the power she needed, hidden beneath layers of anonymity and strategic silence. They had no idea who she truly was, and that was her greatest weapon. The following Monday, the echoes of the party lingered in the office like an unwelcome guest. The open-plan workspace buzzed with casual chatter, most of it revolving around the weekend's gala. Grace walked in, as she did every day, dressed in her usual professional attire, a tailored blouse, simple slacks, and her ever-present notebook tucked under her arm. She passed Robert's desk, and he didn't bother to look up. Amanda shot her a glance, stifling a giggle, as if the memory of mocking her was still fresh. Grace responded with the same composed smile she always wore, but inside, she catalogued every sneer, every dismissive glance, like pieces of a puzzle she was methodically assembling. At the morning briefing, Grace sat quietly at the back of the conference room, taking notes while the executives debated marketing strategies and quarterly earnings. Robert dominated the discussion with his usual arrogance, making snide remarks about lower-level staff's incompetence. "I mean, how hard is it to get coffee orders right?" he joked, glancing over his shoulder toward Grace, eliciting more laughter. She didn't flinch. Instead, she continued writing, her pen gliding smoothly over the page, jotting down not meeting notes, but mental notes, documenting behavior, tracking patterns. What they mistook for subservience was strategic observation. After the meeting, Robert approached her desk with a cocky grin, holding out his empty coffee cup. "Think you could work your magic on this? You know, "Since that's your specialty," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Grace took the cup with steady hands, her expression unreadable. "Of course," she replied softly, her tone polite but void of warmth. As she walked to the break room, her mind wasn't on the coffee. It was on the documents stored in her secure files, the emails she'd archived, the contracts she'd reviewed without anyone realizing she had the authority to do so. They had no idea that the person they dismissed as insignificant was the one holding the strings behind the scenes. Grace had perfected the art of wearing masks, smiling when needed, nodding when expected, and speaking only when it served her purpose. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind sharp as a blade, quietly cutting through layers of corporate arrogance. After work, she returned to her modest apartment, where the facade slipped away. Her small living room was filled with documents, spreadsheets, and legal papers. Hidden in plain sight was the evidence of her true identity: bank statements linked to shell companies, contracts signed under pseudonyms, and stock certificates that told the real story. Grace Nolan wasn't just an assistant, she was the silent owner of the very company that treated her like an afterthought. Sitting at her desk, she reviewed reports from her legal team, detailing the acquisition deals she'd orchestrated through intermediaries. She'd spent years building her empire, brick by strategic brick, all while the people in the office believed she was nothing more than a glorified secretary. She'd inherited the foundation from her late father, whose business acumen had been buried under corporate politics after his death. Grace vowed to reclaim what was rightfully hers, but not with grand announcements or public declarations. No, she preferred the quiet dismantling of egos, the kind that left people stunned, questioning how they never saw it coming. As she closed her laptop for the night, Grace allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. The mockery from the party had stung more than she'd admit, not because she cared about their opinions, but because it reminded her of all the times she'd been underestimated in life. But those moments had shaped her, forged her resilience, and taught her the power of silence. They laughed at her now, but soon, the laughter would stop. Not with revenge, but with revelation. And when that day came, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone would be enough. Office gossip is like wildfire, small embers that ignite into roaring blazes without warning. Grace listened to it all, blending into the background as her colleagues speculated about management decisions, budget cuts, and office romances. No one suspected that she wasn't just eavesdropping for amusement. She was gathering data, piecing together the office's social dynamics. Each whispered rumor revealed more about the people around her, their ambitions, insecurities, and alliances. She learned who was loyal, who was opportunistic, and who could be manipulated with the right incentive. At lunch, Grace sat alone in the break room, flipping through a company report while snippets of conversation floated around her. Robert's voice was unmistakable, boasting about his invaluable contributions to the company's recent successes. Amanda chimed in, laughing at his exaggerated tales, her voice dripping with the same false charm she used during meetings. Grace didn't react. She didn't need to. Their arrogance was her camouflage, their ignorance her shield. They were too busy underestimating her to realize they were standing in the shadow of the person who controlled their careers. Later that day, Grace received an email from the company's board of directors, an invitation to a confidential meeting scheduled for the following week. She smiled faintly, knowing the time for revelations was drawing closer. The board knew who she was, of course. They'd been briefed months ago, their cooperation secured through a combination of legal leverage and strategic persuasion. The meeting wasn't for introductions, it was for confirmations. Soon, the people who mocked her would have to face the truth that the woman they dismissed as insignificant was the architect of their professional lives. Grace sat in her modest apartment, surrounded by documents that painted the true portrait of her life. It wasn't the cramped one-bedroom space that reflected her reality, but rather the neatly organized files locked away in her discreet safe. Shareholder agreements, legal contracts, and stock certificates, each bearing signatures that traced back to anonymous holding companies she controlled. Her financial influence stretched beyond Westbridge Enterprises, with silent stakes in tech firms, consulting agencies, and even a recruitment firm responsible for hiring half of the executives who belittled her. She had strategically woven herself into the fabric of the company, not as a thread to be noticed, but as the very loom that held everything together. Every step she took to maintain the facade of being an ordinary assistant was deliberate. She'd drive an old sedan despite owning luxury vehicles registered under corporate subsidiaries. Her wardrobe was carefully curated to reflect professionalism without opulence. Even her demeanor, modest, agreeable, unassuming, was part of the illusion. While her colleagues traded gossip by the coffee machine, Grace was finalizing board decisions from behind the scenes, her directives filtered through trusted intermediaries. The beauty of power, she'd learned, wasn't in being seen but in being felt, like gravity, silent, invisible, yet impossible to escape. Despite the layers of control she held, Grace often reflected on the cost of her strategy. There were days she longed to shed the mask, to stand tall and claim her accomplishments without restraint. But patience was her ally, and timing was her weapon. She knew the corporate world thrived on perceptions. The more underestimated she was, the more devastating the revelation would be when the time came. The recent office party had only reinforced her resolve. Every sneer, every joke at her expense, was another thread tightening the noose around the arrogance of people like Robert and Amanda. Soon, they'd realize the truth, not with a dramatic announcement, but through a simple, undeniable fact. Grace Nolan wasn't just part of the company, she was the company. Long before boardrooms and corporate strategies, Grace's life revolved around the dusty shelves of her father's small office. He was a self-made entrepreneur, a man whose vision far exceeded the confines of the modest business he'd built from scratch. Growing up, Grace would sit quietly in the corner, observing him navigate contracts, negotiate deals, and make decisions that shaped not just his company but the lives of the employees who depended on him. She absorbed it all: the language of leadership, the art of persuasion, the subtle dynamics of power. But it wasn't until his sudden death that she realized how fragile success could be when vultures circled, disguised as trusted advisors and friends. Her father's passing triggered a swift unraveling. Business partners who once praised him swooped in to divide his empire, exploiting legal loopholes and corporate technicalities. The company he'd nurtured with dedication was carved apart and absorbed into larger conglomerates, leaving Grace and her mother with little more than memories and a bitter lesson in corporate betrayal. But while her mother mourned the loss, Grace plotted her path forward. She was determined not to reclaim what was lost, but to build something so formidable it couldn't be stolen. She would operate from the shadows, where no one could undermine her because no one would know where her influence began or ended. Her journey started humbly, taking administrative roles that allowed her to study corporate ecosystems from within. She enrolled in night classes, earning degrees in finance and business management under an alias to avoid attention. She networked discreetly, investing small amounts that grew into substantial holdings. Over time, she created a labyrinth of shell companies, each strategically positioned to gain influence without revealing the mastermind behind them. By the time she joined Westbridge Enterprises as an assistant, she already controlled a significant portion of its shares. The irony of filing paperwork for executives whose careers she could end with a signature wasn't lost on her. It was poetic justice, served cold, with a side of quiet satisfaction. Grace often found herself revisiting the pivotal moments that shaped her philosophy on power. One such memory was etched vividly in her mind, the day she watched her mother confront one of her father's former business partners. He was a man who had once shared family dinners with them, now seated across from her mother with the smug confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. Grace, barely a teenager then, watched silently from the doorway as her mother's polite composure cracked under the weight of betrayal. "Trust is a currency," her mother had whispered to her later that night, "but power is the vault. Never confuse the two." That lesson became the foundation of Grace's strategy. She never sought validation or approval from others because she understood how fickle those could be. Instead, she accumulated influence quietly, ensuring she never owed anyone more than they owed her. Every relationship in her professional life was transactional, every favor calculated. While her colleagues built their careers on charisma and office politics, Grace constructed an empire rooted in unassailable leverage. She didn't need to charm people like Robert or Amanda, she needed them to remain oblivious until they were too entangled in their own arrogance to escape the consequences. Yet, beneath her meticulously crafted armor, Grace grappled with the weight of isolation. Power, she realized, was a lonely pursuit. She couldn't share her victories without exposing her secrets, nor could she seek comfort in friendships built on authenticity. The few people who knew the truth, legal advisors, financial managers, and her silent board contacts, were bound by contracts, not loyalty. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after midnight, she'd wonder if the price of her success was worth the solitude it demanded. But then she'd remember the sneering faces from the office party, the dismissive tones of executives who saw her as nothing more than background noise, and she'd reaffirm her purpose. She wasn't building a legacy for recognition. She was building it to ensure no one could ever take it away. The foundation of Westbridge Enterprises had been laid long before Grace ever stepped foot in its sleek, glass-walled offices. What the current executives didn't know was that the company's roots traced back to her father's original venture, a small logistics firm that had been quietly rebranded and absorbed into the corporate giant it was today. Through a series of mergers, acquisitions, and strategic rebranding, the name had changed, but the core assets and operational framework remained the same. Grace had spent years tracing those corporate breadcrumbs, uncovering the hidden legacy that tied her family's past to her present. When she first realized the connection, it felt surreal. The very office building where she fetched coffee and scheduled meetings was constructed on the remnants of her father's empire. The irony was both painful and empowering. Rather than fueling resentment, it ignited a sense of purpose. This wasn't just a job or a clever scheme, it was reclamation. But Grace had no interest in sentimental gestures. She didn't want a plaque on the wall commemorating her father or a ceremonial acknowledgement of his contributions. She wanted control, unquestionable, irrevocable control. Her acquisition strategy shifted after that revelation. She no longer viewed her investments in Westbridge as part of a broader portfolio, they became her priority. She leveraged her influence to secure board votes, strategically placed allies in key positions, and gradually increased her stake until she held the majority through layered subsidiaries. By the time the executives mocked her at the office party, she was already their highest-ranking shareholder. The power dynamic was in her favor, they just didn't know it yet. But they would. The corporate world had taught Grace many lessons, but none as brutal as the reality of betrayal. Early in her career, she trusted a mentor, a seasoned executive named Harold, who had taken an interest in her potential. He'd guided her through the complexities of mergers and acquisitions, offering advice that seemed invaluable at the time. Grace, hungry for knowledge and validation, absorbed everything he shared, believing his support was genuine. But Harold wasn't a mentor out of altruism. He saw her as a pawn, someone he could mold and eventually control to serve his own ambitions. It wasn't until she discovered that he'd been siphoning off her investments, using insider knowledge to manipulate stock prices, that the illusion shattered. The betrayal stung, not because she'd lost money, she recovered that easily enough, but because it exposed a vulnerability she thought she'd outgrown. Grace responded not with confrontation but with calculation. She gathered evidence, documented every fraudulent transaction, and built an airtight case. When the time was right, she presented her findings to regulatory authorities anonymously, ensuring Harold's downfall was both public and irreversible. That experience solidified her belief that trust was a liability in business. From then on, she operated with surgical precision, compartmentalizing every relationship and safeguarding her autonomy. Even the board members who technically outranked her on paper were kept at arm's length, their influence diluted through strategic checks and balances. Grace had no interest in personal alliances. Her empire was built on contracts, not connections, and that made it unbreakable. Grace's position as an executive assistant was the perfect disguise. It gave her unrestricted access to the inner workings of Westbridge Enterprises, board meeting schedules, confidential memos, strategic plans, and even the personal calendars of the very executives who dismissed her as irrelevant. She was the silent observer, the invisible thread woven through every department, privy to conversations that most employees could only speculate about. While Robert boasted about marketing strategies he barely understood and Amanda plotted office politics to climb the corporate ladder, Grace listened, documented, and analyzed. They mistook her silence for submission, never realizing she was gathering the kind of intel that could dismantle their careers with a single email. Her office, a modest cubicle tucked beside the executive wing, was a command center in disguise. Behind the neatly stacked files and post-it notes was a sophisticated system of encrypted drives containing everything from expense report discrepancies to confidential merger details. Grace didn't need to spy, her job gave her access most people fought years to obtain. She'd mastered the art of appearing harmless, blending into the background while subtly steering conversations and decisions. Even the company's CEO, Daniel Whitmore, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail, barely acknowledged her presence beyond the occasional curt nod. But Grace preferred it that way. She thrived in the shadows, manipulating outcomes without leaving fingerprints. Every time Robert forwarded sensitive documents to her without reading them, trusting that she was just the secretary, it reinforced how blind they all were to the real dynamics at play. They didn't realize the woman booking their flights and managing their schedules was also reviewing their quarterly performance reports, identifying vulnerabilities, and silently tightening her grip on the company's future. While her colleagues scrambled for promotions and office recognition, Grace played a different game entirely, one that didn't require applause or acknowledgement. She understood that real power wasn't about titles or nameplates on glass doors. It was about influence, ownership, and control. Through a network of shell companies, private equity firms, and discrete partnerships, she had been slowly acquiring shares in Westbridge Enterprises. The transactions were meticulously structured to appear as routine market activities, buried under layers of corporate entities that shielded her identity as the ultimate beneficiary. Grace's strategy was simple: remain invisible until she held enough leverage to be undeniable. She diversified her investments, not just within Westbridge but across industries connected to it, supply chains, consulting firms, even tech companies that provided essential software to their operations. By the time she controlled a significant portion of the company's stock, she also influenced key vendors and strategic partners. Her reach extended far beyond the office walls, a silent empire built on precision and patience. Her most brilliant move, however, was positioning herself as irreplaceable without anyone realizing it. She automated workflows, streamlined executive processes, and created systems that subtly depended on her oversight. If she disappeared overnight, the ripple effect would expose just how integral she was to the company's stability. But Grace had no intention of disappearing. She was building towards a crescendo, a moment where she'd no longer need to hide behind anonymity. The foundation was set, all that remained was to execute the final phase. Despite her calculated independence, Grace had one confidant in her life who knew the full extent of her ambitions: Evelyn Sinclair, a retired corporate attorney with a reputation for dismantling Fortune 500 companies through ruthless litigation. Evelyn had met Grace during a business seminar years ago, where she'd immediately recognized the sharp intellect behind Grace's unassuming demeanor. What started as casual mentorship evolved into a strategic partnership. Evelyn became Grace's advisor, guiding her through complex legal maneuvers, structuring her hidden acquisitions, and teaching her the nuances of corporate warfare. Evelyn was the antithesis of Grace's office persona: bold, unapologetic, and fierce. She never minced words, often reminding Grace that sentiment was the enemy of strategy. "They don't respect you because they think you're small," Evelyn had once said over a glass of scotch in her penthouse apartment. But small things can be sharp. A needle can bleed a giant. Those words stuck with Grace, fueling her determination to maintain the facade of insignificance while sharpening her proverbial needles behind the scenes. Their partnership was built on mutual respect, not dependency. Evelyn provided legal counsel and strategic advice, but Grace made the decisions. Together, they crafted a roadmap for corporate domination that bypassed traditional power structures. Evelyn had taught her how to weaponize patience, how to let arrogance be the downfall of those too blind to see past their own egos. And now, as Grace prepared for the final phase of her plan, Evelyn's guidance echoed louder than ever. Grace's financial empire didn't grow overnight. It was the result of years of disciplined investments, strategic partnerships, and calculated risks. She diversified her portfolio across industries: real estate, technology, healthcare, and renewable energy, ensuring that her wealth wasn't just vast but resilient. Each investment was connected by a common thread: influence. She didn't just buy stocks, she acquired voting rights. She didn't just invest in companies, she secured board seats through proxies. Her empire wasn't built on visibility but on the silent power to sway decisions without ever stepping into the spotlight. Her holdings in Westbridge were layered through international entities, trusts, and offshore accounts, creating a corporate labyrinth even the most seasoned auditors would struggle to navigate. This complexity served two purposes: it protected her identity and insulated her assets from legal vulnerabilities. Grace knew that power was fragile if it depended on public perception. She designed her empire to be untouchable, hidden in plain sight, with contingencies in place to protect it from hostile takeovers, regulatory scrutiny, or personal attacks. Yet, for all her financial achievements, Grace never allowed complacency to creep in. She continued to live modestly, dressing conservatively, driving an average car, and maintaining her role as the efficient, unremarkable assistant. This dual existence, billionaire by assets, secretary by appearance, was both her greatest strategy and her most profound irony. She controlled more wealth than the executives she served coffee to, yet they dismissed her as inconsequential. That cognitive dissonance was the cornerstone of her plan. They couldn't see the threat because they refused to believe it existed. The culmination of Grace's strategy hinged on one final acquisition: an investment firm that held a minority stake in Westbridge but wielded significant voting power due to historical shareholder agreements. Negotiating this deal was complex, requiring months of covert discussions, legal gymnastics, and strategic leverage. But Grace thrived in complexity. She approached the negotiation with surgical precision, using her extensive knowledge of Westbridge's internal operations to highlight synergies and mitigate perceived risks. The acquisition closed quietly, without fanfare or public announcements. To the outside world, it was just another routine corporate transaction, buried in financial reports that few bothered to read. But for Grace, it was the keystone that completed her empire. With this firm under her control, she now held the majority of voting rights at Westbridge Enterprises, effectively giving her unilateral power over the company's future. She could appoint executives, restructure departments, and even dissolve the board if she chose to. Sitting alone in her apartment that evening, Grace stared at the final signed contract. It felt surreal, years of meticulous planning distilled into a few sheets of paper. But there was no dramatic celebration, no champagne toast. Just a quiet acknowledgement that she had won. The girl who once watched her father's legacy be stolen had reclaimed not just his company but her own identity. Yet, the victory wasn't in the ownership. It was in the fact that no one saw it coming. And soon, they would. As the city lights flickered outside her window, Grace sat in the stillness of her apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The silence felt different now, not the emptiness of solitude, but the calm before a storm she had meticulously engineered. She thought of her father, of the lessons etched into her memory through his words and actions. He had built a company with integrity, only to watch it crumble under the weight of betrayal. Grace had built an empire with strategy, ensuring no one could ever dismantle it without her consent. The faces of her colleagues flashed in her mind, Robert with his arrogant smirk, Amanda with her condescending laughter, Daniel Whitmore with his oblivious authority. They were all pawns in a game they didn't even realize they were playing. Tomorrow, that would change. The board meeting was scheduled, the agenda set. But what they expected to be a routine quarterly review would become the unveiling of the truth they had ignored for years. Grace wasn't just attending the meeting, she was running it. As she prepared for the day ahead, Grace felt no anxiety, only anticipation. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was reclaiming what was hers. The final act wasn't about proving her worth, it was about revealing what had been true all along. She didn't need to raise her voice or deliver grand speeches. Her presence, backed by undeniable authority, would be enough. And when she walked into that boardroom, it wouldn't be as the assistant they overlooked. It would be as the owner they never saw coming. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the usual hustle and bustle at Westbridge Enterprises. Employees filtered into the sleek glass building, their footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. Grace walked through the lobby like she did every day, head held high, her expression calm and composed. There was nothing extraordinary about her presence, and that was precisely how she wanted it. The security guard gave her a familiar nod, and the receptionist barely glanced up. No one suspected that today was anything other than routine. But for Grace, it was the culmination of years of meticulous planning, woven through layers of anonymity and strategy. As she reached her desk, she noticed Robert striding past with his usual arrogance, his booming voice filling the corridor as he laughed at some trivial joke. Amanda wasn't far behind, clutching her designer handbag, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. They barely acknowledged Grace, treating her with the same dismissive indifference they always had. But beneath her calm exterior, Grace's heart beat with anticipation, not from nerves, but from the thrill of knowing that by the end of the day, the power dynamic would be irrevocably shifted. She glanced at the clock, its ticking louder in her mind than usual. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Grace gathered her notes, not because she needed them, but because it maintained the illusion. Her reflection in the glass door of the conference room showed the same composed figure she'd always been. But today, she wasn't just the assistant. Today, she was the storm they never saw coming. The boardroom was a testament to corporate opulence, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city's skyline, a long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen, and sleek leather chairs occupied by individuals who believed they controlled the fate of Westbridge Enterprises. The air buzzed with casual conversation as board members discussed stock performance, market trends, and upcoming projects. Grace entered quietly, taking her usual seat near the corner, her notepad open, pen poised as if she were there to merely document the meeting. Daniel Whitmore, the CEO, cleared his throat and began the session with his usual authoritative tone. Robert leaned back in his chair with smug confidence, occasionally glancing at Grace with the same condescending smirk he always wore. Amanda whispered comments to the colleague beside her, her laughter soft but pointed. They were oblivious to the storm brewing within the very walls they thought they owned. Grace waited patiently as the agenda progressed, her face a mask of professionalism. Then, as Daniel moved to conclude the meeting, Grace stood up, not abruptly, but with the calm authority of someone who had every right to command attention. The room grew quiet, puzzled glances exchanged among the board members. Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Is there something you'd like to add, Grace?" he asked, his tone dismissive. She smiled slightly, her voice steady as she replied, "Yes, actually. I believe there's one final item on the agenda, an update on company ownership and leadership." The room shifted subtly, the casual air replaced by a ripple of confusion. Robert snorted under his breath, exchanging amused glances with Amanda, clearly thinking Grace had overstepped. "Ownership and leadership?" Robert chuckled. "Grace, this is a board meeting, not an admin briefing." His voice dripped with condescension, confident that whatever point she was trying to make would be as insignificant as he believed her to be. But Grace's smile didn't waver. She pulled a sleek folder from her bag, placing it neatly on the table. "Actually, Robert, I believe this will be of interest to everyone here." Her voice was calm, her words deliberate. The board members leaned in, curiosity piqued. Grace opened the folder, revealing documents stamped with legal seals, ownership transfers, acquisition agreements, and controlling interest declarations. Daniel frowned, reaching for the papers, his eyes scanning the pages. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something darker, realization. Amanda's smile faltered, and Robert's smugness evaporated as he leaned forward, reading over Daniel's shoulder. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, his voice sharp now. Grace met his gaze without flinching. "This, Daniel, is the documentation confirming my controlling interest in Westbridge Enterprises. Effective immediately, I hold the majority of voting rights. I am now the principal shareholder and your new superior." Silence gripped the room, thick and suffocating. Robert's face turned pale, his jaw slack as he processed her words. Amanda clutched her pen so tightly it snapped between her fingers, the sound startling in the stillness. Daniel's authority crumbled before their eyes, his confidence dissolving like mist under the harsh light of undeniable truth. Grace remained standing, her posture impeccable, exuding the calm of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. "You're joking," Robert finally stammered, his voice hoarse. "This is some kind of mistake." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously over the documents, the legal signatures glaring back at him with irrefutable proof. "No mistake," Grace replied smoothly. "Every acquisition, every transfer, every vote, it's all there." I've been preparing for this moment for years, and today is simply the formal acknowledgement of what's already been true. Daniel tried to recover, clearing his throat and attempting to regain control. This is highly irregular. You can't just— I can, Grace interrupted, her voice cool and firm. And I have. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping over the room. The difference between you and me, Daniel, is that while you were busy flaunting power, I was busy building it. The words hung in the air, final and unchallengeable. Daniel's face flushed with frustration, his polished demeanor cracking. You've been deceiving us all this time, he spat, his voice rising. Pretending to be— what? A secretary? His words were laced with disbelief, as if the very idea offended him more than the reality of his lost authority. Grace tilted her head slightly, her smile never reaching her eyes. I didn't pretend to be anything. You simply never bothered to look beyond what you assumed. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is absurd. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? You don't have the experience to run a company like this. His voice was desperate now, the bravado gone, replaced by fear masquerading as indignation. Grace's gaze met his with icy precision. Experience? You mean the kind that involves cutting corners, exploiting employees, and covering up financial discrepancies? She reached into her folder again, pulling out documents detailing Robert's unethical practices, misappropriated funds, inflated reports, and questionable vendor contracts. The color drained from Robert's face as he realized how deeply she had been watching, documenting, preparing. Amanda shrank in her seat, her earlier arrogance evaporating like morning dew under the harsh glare of the sun. Daniel tried one last time to assert control. You'll regret this, he hissed. Grace leaned in slightly, her voice a soft whisper that carried the weight of absolute power. No, Daniel. The only thing I regret is how long I let you believe you were in charge. The boardroom was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the glass windows. Robert remained frozen, his face drained of all its usual arrogance. Amanda's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the damning documents Grace had laid out. Daniel, whose authority had been a given for years, now looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff, desperately trying to maintain footing where none remained. Grace stood at the head of the table, poised and confident, her very presence an undeniable testament to the power she had kept hidden for so long. You spent years mocking me, Grace said softly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of every dismissal, every condescending remark they had ever thrown her way. You saw what you wanted to see, a secretary, invisible, insignificant. But the truth is, I've been here longer than you. I've sat through every meeting, read every report, and listened to every careless word you thought I couldn't understand. She let her gaze drift across the room, pausing on each face, savoring the disbelief etched into their features. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Grace raised a hand, silencing him without effort. I hold controlling interest in Westbridge Enterprises. That means I decide who stays, who goes, and how this company moves forward. You see, while you were busy climbing the corporate ladder, I was buying the building it leaned against. The metaphor hung in the air, sharp and final. The room shifted as the reality settled in. Grace wasn't just part of the company. She was the company. Daniel's composure finally broke. His face flushed an angry red as he leaned forward, his voice rising in desperation. You can't do this. You don't have the right. His words were hollow, lacking the conviction they once carried. Grace didn't flinch. She simply reached for another folder, sliding it across the table toward him. Actually, I do. Here's the legal documentation confirming the transfer of voting rights, board approvals, and acquisition agreements. It's all legitimate, checked and verified. Robert snatched the folder from Daniel, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. His eyes darted from line to line, searching for something, anything, that could invalidate what was now undeniable. But the truth was written in ink, stamped with legal seals, and signed by people far more powerful than he had ever been. Amanda sank lower in her chair, her face pale, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. She had spent years mocking the very woman who now held her career in the palm of her hand. Grace stepped back slightly, her arms crossed loosely, her face calm and controlled. You see, she continued, power isn't about who speaks the loudest or who demands the most attention. Real power is silent, patient, and strategic. It doesn't need to announce itself because it's already there, shaping decisions and controlling outcomes before anyone even realizes. The words sliced through the room, leaving nothing but the undeniable truth in their wake. Grace moved methodically, laying out document after document, evidence of financial mismanagement, unethical business practices, and breaches of corporate policy. Each paper was a nail in the coffin of those who had thrived on arrogance and deceit. Robert's fraudulent expense reports, Amanda's manipulation of vendor contracts for personal gain, Daniel's misuse of company resources, all exposed with clinical precision. The pile of evidence grew, a mountain of proof that none of them could deny or deflect. You thought I was just taking notes, Grace said, her voice soft but razor-sharp. But I was documenting everything. Every mistake, every unethical decision, every time you thought you were untouchable, I was there, not just watching but recording. She let the silence stretch, the weight of her words settling heavily on the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze, others staring at the documents as if hoping they might disappear. Daniel finally slumped back in his chair, defeated. Robert's bravado had long since evaporated, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who realized too late that he had underestimated the wrong person. Amanda, once so quick with her sharp tongue, sat in stunned silence, her face devoid of its usual smugness. Grace had stripped them of their illusions, leaving them exposed and powerless in a room where they had once believed they reigned supreme. Grace's voice remained calm as she delivered the verdicts, her words precise and unyielding. Robert, your actions have violated multiple clauses in your employment contract, including breach of fiduciary duty and financial misconduct. Your termination is effective immediately. She slid a prepared letter across the table, the bold header reading notice of termination. Robert's hands shook as he picked it up, his face a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. There was no room for argument, his downfall had been meticulously prepared, just like everything else Grace had done. Amanda, Grace continued, turning her attention to the woman who had once sneered at her for being just a secretary. Your unethical dealings with vendors and misuse of company funds have been documented thoroughly. Consider this your final day at Westbridge. Another letter slid across the table. Amanda's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. The weight of her own arrogance had finally crushed her, leaving no room for protest. Lastly, Grace turned to Daniel, the man who had once believed himself untouchable. Daniel, as CEO, you were responsible for upholding the integrity of this company. Instead, you allowed corruption to thrive under your leadership. Your contract has been reviewed, and based on the board's authority, which I now hold, you are hereby removed from your position. Daniel didn't even reach for the letter. He simply sat there, staring at Grace with hollow eyes, his career unraveled by the very woman he had dismissed for years. As the dismissed executives left the boardroom, their footsteps heavy with the weight of their own downfall, Grace remained standing, her heart steady. There were no triumphant shouts or dramatic speeches, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The silence was her victory song, the empty chairs her trophies. She didn't need applause or acknowledgement. The shift in power spoke louder than words ever could. The remaining board members, who had been silent observers throughout the confrontation, now looked at Grace with a mixture of respect and awe. They had underestimated her too, but unlike Robert, Amanda, and Daniel, they had the sense to recognize her authority. Grace addressed them with the same calm precision. Westbridge Enterprises will move forward with integrity and accountability. The days of arrogance and corruption are over. This company will thrive, not because of titles or egos, but because of leadership rooted in vision and resilience. She gathered her papers, leaving the boardroom with the same quiet grace she had entered. But everything had changed. She wasn't just the assistant anymore. She was the architect of a new era for Westbridge Enterprises, the woman who had conquered an empire without ever raising her voice. News of the leadership shakeup spread through the company like wildfire. Employees whispered in hallways, speculating about the sudden departures of high-ranking executives. The shock was palpable. After all, Grace had been the invisible figure, the background presence in every meeting, every office event. Now she was the name on everyone's lips, the story that reshaped the narrative of Westbridge Enterprises. But Grace didn't bask in the attention. Instead, she focused on rebuilding the company from the inside out. She initiated audits, restructured departments, and implemented new policies to promote transparency and ethical practices. The toxic culture that had festered under Daniel's leadership was dismantled piece by piece. Employees who had once felt overlooked now found themselves part of a company that valued their contributions. Grace's influence wasn't just felt in board meetings, it reached every corner of the organization, a ripple effect that transformed the very fabric of Westbridge Enterprises. Despite her newfound authority, Grace maintained her quiet demeanor. She didn't need grand gestures to assert her power. Her actions spoke for themselves, woven into the company's renewed success. She had built an empire, not for recognition, but for legacy, a testament to the strength of resilience, strategy, and the unyielding pursuit of purpose. Late at night, Grace often found herself alone in her office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. She'd sit by the window, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The path had been paved with sacrifices, moments of solitude, betrayal survived, and countless days spent hidden in plain sight. But through it all, she had never lost sight of her purpose. She thought of her father, the man whose legacy had been stolen but never forgotten. His lessons had shaped her, not through words alone, but through the resilience he'd shown even in defeat. Grace had honored him not by clinging to the past, but by forging her own path, one that reclaimed his vision and transformed it into something even greater. But it wasn't just about legacy. It was about growth. Grace had evolved from the girl who watched silently from the sidelines to the woman who orchestrated change with precision and grace. She didn't seek revenge. She sought transformation. And she had achieved it, not through force, but through the quiet, undeniable power of strategic resilience. Months after the takeover, Grace received an unexpected message, a request for a meeting from Evelyn Sinclair, her former mentor. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the towering offices of Westbridge. Evelyn looked at her with a rare softness, a hint of pride in her sharp eyes. "You did it," she said simply, no need for elaborate congratulations. Grace nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I did." They spoke of the past, the choices made, the battles fought. But as the conversation deepened, Evelyn's tone shifted. "You've built an empire, Grace. But don't forget to live beyond it." The words lingered, striking a chord Grace hadn't acknowledged in years. She realized that in her pursuit of power, she had isolated herself. The walls she built to protect her empire had also kept out connection, friendship, even love. It was time to let some of those walls down, not to weaken herself, but to embrace the fullness of life beyond the boardroom. Grace returned to Westbridge with a renewed perspective. Leadership wasn't just about strategy and control, it was about people. She began to foster a culture of mentorship, investing in young talents who reminded her of herself at the start of her journey. She created programs for employee growth, championed diversity, and ensured that every voice had a place at the table. Her leadership style was unconventional, quiet yet firm, approachable yet commanding. Employees admired her not just for her accomplishments but for her authenticity. She was proof that you didn't need to be the loudest in the room to be the most powerful. Her journey had been one of reclamation, but her future was one of purpose. Westbridge thrived under her guidance, not because she controlled it with an iron fist, but because she led with vision and integrity. The company became a reflection of her values, a place where resilience was celebrated, and humility was seen as strength. Years later, Grace stood in the same boardroom where she had once revealed her true identity. The city's skyline stretched beyond the windows, unchanged yet entirely different. She looked around at the new faces, leaders she had mentored, rising stars she had believed in. Her journey had come full circle, but her legacy was just beginning. She knew that true power wasn't in titles or wealth. It was in the impact you left behind, the lives you touched, and the lessons you passed on. Grace Nolan's name became synonymous with resilience, not because of the empire she built, but because of how she built it, with quiet strength, unwavering purpose, and the courage to be underestimated. As she left the boardroom, the echoes of the past faded, replaced by the steady beat of a future she had shaped. She had been the invisible thread, the silent architect, the underestimated force. And now, she was the legacy that would inspire generations to come.